Welcome. We are very excited to have our audience here to spend Sunday afternoon with us. We're putting up a poll to start with, so if you could take a chance to fill that out. It's only got a couple of questions. We appreciate your help. So we'll be silent for a couple minutes while that's up. So if you just joined us, we have a poll up that we would really appreciate your attention to. There's a few questions to help us know how medical misinformation has impacted you and your lives. Fill those out. We're waiting for people to complete that, so we have some numbers for our speakers to be able to draw on. Hey, last reminder for those that have just joined us, we have a poll up on the screen, I hope, with multiple questions, and we'd like to have you complete that, and we'll start within the next minute. Okay, she said 10 to 15 seconds. So we have a proverb up on the screen today that we thought was appropriate for our session. The lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. So we hope you've come today to learn a little bit about what we can do to prevent the taking so much time to put on your shoes. Let's see here. So I want to welcome you again. We're excited to have you here, our audience, to spend part of your Sunday afternoon with us. My name is Jerry Geyer, and I'm a member of Indivisible Tri-Valley and part of our science and public health team. We are pleased to bring you our second educational event, this one on understanding medical misinformation through a scientific lens. Let's see, we've put the poll up. We'll go over the results on the poll a little before we start with the speakers. So today we'll explore what medical misinformation really means, how widespread it is, why we're susceptible to conspiracy theories, why it spreads so effectively, and what we can do to stem the flow of misinformation. So before we introduce our experts today, this webinar is being recorded and you will be muted during the session. A recording link will be emailed to each registrant after the session. While the chat will be disabled for participants, we encourage you to ask questions for our panel through the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. Tap the thumbs up at the bottom of the question to help us know which questions are most important to you. Feel free to use react emojis at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We ask everyone to be respectful of each other and to avoid emotional or extreme political opinions unless they have a scientific foundation. Let's see, I think, can we put the poll results back up? Or do I have that? Oh, here we are. So 68% of the people that responded to the poll have been affected by the topic. That's important. And you can see, I'm assuming they can see the breakdown here. 59%.
Yes, they can.
59% are the most, is the biggest topic that people have been impacted by is vaccines, followed by nutrition, then followed by general health care, sorry, and then other, and then cancer. Okay. Well, that's some things for us to dig into. Maybe our speakers can address that as they have also dealt with other audiences to know if that's similar or not. So today we're joined by 4 distinguished experts who bring perspectives from psychiatry, social epidemiology, public health, and clinical medicine. Excuse me. Dr. Joe Pierre is an MD and health sciences clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UCSF. He is the author of Faults: How Mistrust, Disinformation, and Motivated Reasoning Make Us Believe Things That Aren't True. His academic work focuses on delusion-like beliefs, including conspiracy theories. Dr. Jessie Seiler has a PhD in epidemiology, specializing in social epidemiology, and works at the Center for Science in the Public Interest, where she assists in developing campaigns to counter misinformation. Dr. Louise McNitt is a physician specializing in preventive medicine and public health. She is currently with the California Department of Public Health working on vaccine access. And Dr. Marvelle Maloney is a board-certified physician specializing in obstetrics and gynecology. She is currently practicing in the East Bay. All have donated their time for this presentation and are not being paid. They're also speaking in their personal capacities. So before beginning, I feel the need to say that each of our panelists could have been a solo panelist for us with all the information knowledge, but we believed having a cross-section of panelists could better serve our public's needs. So I have a question to all. If you'll briefly introduce yourself and why you chose your specialty, and perhaps one fun fact about yourself. And before we start with the panelists, it's only fair that I share a fun fact. And so my fun fact is I played field hockey in my younger days and loved it very much. Wish I could do it now. So let's start with Dr. Pierre. Could you introduce yourself? I think you're muted.
Oopsie. So my name is Dr. Joe Pierre. Joe, as mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist at UCSF. I practiced in Los Angeles for many years, only moved to the Bay Area a couple of years ago. And let's see, I think the question was, why did I choose my specialty? Well, I think the brain is sort of the big uncharted area of the human body. And I'm just fascinated by illnesses or disorders that affect behavior and also beliefs, which is sort of my favorite academic topic. As far as a fun fact about me, gosh, I don't know. I mean, these days I have a 8-year-old, so pretty much all of my free time is spent following him around. I coached his soccer team this past season, so that's basically what I do in my free time.
Thank you, Dr. Pierre. Dr. Seiler, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's great to be speaking to a Bay Area audience. Am I frozen? Oh, there we go. Okay. I'm actually a native of Los Angeles, so have a lot of great memories of being up in the area. I have a PhD in social epidemiology from the University of Washington, where I'm also an affiliate assistant faculty member. So I get to teach a lot, which is really great. But I found my way to CSPI, Center for Science in the Public Interest, because I really wanted to be doing something public health action oriented on health misinformation. I got into this field, I think, because I was just fascinated with how people change their minds and why people change their minds. And, it had been my experience that if you ask someone, when was the last time you changed your mind about something really big, you got stunned silence or the most fascinating thing anyone's ever said to you. So that's why I got into this field. I love public health. It's my favorite place in the world. And in terms of fun facts, I honestly don't think I have any fun facts. Just my mind is a total blank. I will say I have a boring fact, which is that I've eaten oatmeal for breakfast for pretty much every single day for the last, I don't know, it might be 15 or 20 years at this point. I'm honestly not sure. So that's my boring fact. Yeah,
Fantastic. Hope that was based on scientific information, right?
it's really like oatmeal, frankly. What a delightful thing. So yeah.
Dr. McNitt, could you introduce yourself and share a fun fact if you can think of one?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Louise McNitt. Louise is good. I am a doctor that specializes in preventive medicine and public health at the State Health Department. The reason I chose my specialty, it's related to my fun fact. The fun fact is that I actually started my career as an entomologist. I have a master's degree in entomology. And as I was learning about entomology, the reason I went to entomology was because I was very interested and concerned about the environment. And I think what I kind of realized during my studies was that the health of human populations really have a huge impact on the environment, and the healthier that people are, the healthier the environment is. And so that is what stimulated my interest in public health. And so then I went back and got my medical degree and my master's in public health.
Fantastic. Very interesting. Let's see. Dr. Maloney, I think you're our last up. Will you introduce yourself and tell us a fun fact if you have one?
Hi, I'm Marvelle Maloney. I specialize in OBGYN, primarily gynecology currently, and minimally invasive surgery. I chose my specialty because I was exposed to women's healthcare all my life. My mother was a midwife, and I'm one of 5 girls. So, women's health is very important to me. Fun fact, I am from a very small island in the Caribbean called St. Kitts, and it's only 64 square miles. And I recently moved to the Bay Area about 3 years ago. I did most of my training and previously worked in New York tri-state area.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. So Dr. Maloney, I'm just going to say, it looks like your screen is cutting off part of your face with the title. I don't know if you can adjust it. There you go. Thank you very much. Okay, well, let's begin. I want to remind you also to put your questions into the Q&A on the bottom of the webinar as we're talking, so that we can go to our audience participation. Let's begin by defining what we mean when we talk about medical misinformation. So I'm going to start with Dr. McNitt. From a public health perspective, what do we mean by medical misinformation? How is it different from simple misunderstanding or incomplete information or intentionally misleading information?
In my experience, I'll probably leave a lot of that question to maybe Jessie or Joe to talk more about sort of like the analysis of mis and disinformation. I mean, I will say that from in our perspective, we have to deal with it all the time. And whether it's intentional or not intentional, it kind of has the same impact on people's choices and maybe them not making the best choices for themselves.
Okay.
And well, I'll stop there because I think we'll get into sort of
Okay.
how we manage it later.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Let me ask Jessie if you can define that, flesh that out a little bit more. I think in your field, you've probably had to decide whether it's just simple misunderstanding, incomplete information, or is it being intentionally misleading? Could you help
Yeah.
us with that?
Yeah, absolutely. With a caveat that I have never in my life been able to read anyone's mind, not even once. And so it is hard to understand intention, of course, unless people are being very upfront with what they're trying to get out of a particular interaction. So misinformation is sort of a general term for false information, and disinformation applies more to misinformation that's spread intentionally. I think these terms get used interchangeably a fair bit, again, because it's hard to understand what people's motivation is. With medical misinformation, it becomes a little, there's some gray area, but we can kind of think of two sort of populations here. One might be a relative or friend or a person you're talking to at the bus stop who has an opinion, heard something on the TV or heard something online that is not correct about a medical condition or about vaccines, for example. And another very different bucket are the influencers, and a lot of you pointed to influencers as places where you've seen misinformation. As they might be spreading this unintentionally. This might be something they're just kind of trying to be like, oh my gosh, I heard this thing, this is wild. Where that creeps into disinformation, though, is where they are profiting off of what they are telling you, which is
Okay.
extremely common. I would say that's one of the bigger red flags. If someone is in a position to monetize a misunderstanding, which especially with social media, it can be really hard to know that creeps into the area of disinformation for me.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
That clears that up a little bit. Dr. Maloney, you work with patients every day. What kinds of misinformation do you most often encounter in clinical practice? And how does it affect patient trust or decision making?
I would say primarily from a clinical perspective. So I deal a lot with patients in a perimenopausal/menopausal time frame of life, which is a big transition. And I think that right now that topic is kind of a hot topic. And so there are a lot of people that have opinions. I think Oprah did a special and Oprah was promoting her own things. And so everyone comes with like a preconceived idea of what the definition of perimenopause/menopause is, and then all the treatment options that are available. I think there are some treatment things that are, I don't know if the correct word is, I guess the word would be disinformation, because there's a monetary proponent to people promoting these treatment options for the management of perimenopause or menopause. And so it affects the ability to appropriately take care of the patient when they're coming in already with a preconceived notion of what should be happening. And so it takes quite a while to build trust with that patient and help them to understand that my perspective or how I want to treat the patient, even if it's in opposition to what they're coming in with, their idea that they're coming in with, ultimately my goal is for them to be well taken care of. So it takes a while to build the relationship, help them to understand my perspective. Obviously, I have to listen to their perspective and what they're trying to get out of it and why their misinformation is important to them. And then coming to some middle ground as to how to move forward.
Great, thank you. That sounds like a lot of work on your part. So we see that misinformation isn't just an online issue. It shows up in exam rooms, community conversations, and social media feeds alike. Dr. Seiler, based on your research, how widespread is medical misinformation today? Are there particular medical topics or platforms where it seems to thrive?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I as a quantitative scientist, as an epidemiologist, I could never give you a pinpoint estimate of how much information out there about medical stuff is false. But I will say that what were our results? We saw that 2/3 of participants in today's webinar have seen misinformation somewhere.
Yes, yes.
I would be willing to put some amount of money on everyone in the webinar having seen some misinformation, right? I think, it really scales on based on how much time you spend online and how much time you spend watching television. I would say that even some ads for prescription drugs feel sort of adjacent to disinformation to me, especially when we think about how the incentive to maybe downplay some of the side effects in order to make a product seem more appealing than it might actually be to the specific individual it's being targeted to. In terms of where we might see it, I was surprised to see that so many people were encountering misinformation on television just because, we think of social media as really being the place for it. And so any sort of format where your attention is the thing that you can provide there. So something like Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, where the goal of those platforms is to keep you on them longer and longer so that you run into more and more ads, right? So you're not paying to be on Facebook, but you are in terms of your attention. So the longer those platforms can keep you on, the better for them. The way they do that, the way they realize they can do that is by pushing you content that engages you. And unfortunately for us, the way our brains are, and maybe Dr. Pierre can speak to this, a lot of that engagement comes in the form of this makes me outraged. I want to like yell about this, or so that sort of hook is so any platform that can kind of incorporate that, I think is going to be a place where misinformation and disinformation both thrive.
Great. It could be that our audience is on the older side and not the 20-year-olds for picking up that that different spread of social media. But I do want to ask, are there age gender differences in these areas on medical misinformation? And how does social media influencers, how they're involved, or are bots a big problem in this sphere?
And that question is for me.
Yeah, that's for you, Dr. Seiler, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think that where there are differences in age or gender in terms of, susceptibility to misinformation or disinformation, it's not to the whole idea of false information. There are particular forms of misinformation or disinformation that do particularly well for certain groups. So I am a millennial. We have an aesthetic, right? There's like a certain sort of boring beige thing that apparently works really well on us. So stuff that's sort of targeted at millennials will often have a specific aesthetic, or will use specific language to tap into a sense of like, oh yes, this is my in group, right? Oh, this is aimed at someone exactly like me. It's coming from someone exactly like me. Whereas something that's aimed at perhaps my parents' generation might have a really different aesthetic, appeal to a different set of sort of nostalgic values and images that play into that. So it's really not about, oh, these people are much more likely to fall for something than these other people. It's more about uh, we are quite sophisticated in terms of advertising, and that's essentially what this is.
Oh, yes. Does anyone else have anything, any of our speakers have anything else to add to that?
Well, maybe I'll just make a couple add-on points. I
Okay.
think those are great answers by Dr. Seiler or Jessie. But just to add a couple of fine points. So I think when I talk about disinformation, yes, there's this idea that the spread of the disinformation is intentional. But I think there's also an implication that not only is it intentional, but the person knows that the information is false. And that's where the motivation comes in. And a lot of times it's financial profit. But I think it's important, particularly for this group, to emphasize that sometimes it's about political power also. There's not always money per se. So that's number one. Number two, as Jessie said, I think the real challenge, even for me as a psychiatrist who can read minds, kidding, of course, but so the challenge is that we don't really know whether or not the person spreading that misinformation is aware that it's false or not. And in my book, I talk about this idea of the disinformation food chain, where you have these, the apex predators who I think often do know that they're spreading false information. But then there's all the people, including sometimes ourselves, that are trapped in the middle. And we're, retweeting or we're spreading information, sometimes knowing that it might not be true, but sometimes also being duped ourselves. And so that line of awareness, I think, can be blurry. I think likewise, if we talk about, what I call the consumers, sort of the bottom of the food chain, which, is often where I sit, I think as a psychiatrist, I often bring up the idea that when we think about belief, it's not an all or nothing phenomenon, right? And if we talk about this topic through a scientific lens, scientists tend to think about the strength of their belief being proportional to the evidence. But that's not how human beings tend to think, right? We don't intuitively think like scientists. So we tend to think, no, I believe this thing to be true, or I believe that to be not true. And so I think when we think about the people who believe in disinformation, we need to kind of think about like how much are they actually believing? And particularly these days with politics, there's good evidence that sometimes people will say, oh, well, I believe this, but they're saying that because of their affiliation with that belief being part of an ideological group, more so than the belief itself. And so I think when we talk about changing belief, it's important to understand those kind of motivations. And the final thing I'll say to reinforce what Jessie was saying is that I think the real challenge in this day and age is that there are so many different sources rather, of information. I always say, compared to when I was a kid, where we all subscribed to the local paper and we had 5 different network TV network stations to watch. Now we have, probably thousands, maybe millions of different informational sources. And so, we live in you could argue it's a free market of information, although in my book, I call it a flea market, because it's really, as Jessie was saying, about who's the loudest, most raucous person that attracts attention. And that's really the economy of information today, right? It's not subscription based. It's, hey, look at me, click on my thing. And the way you do that, and the reason why traditional medical sources of information are often losing the battle against misinformation, is because we're not as shiny and flashy. And sometimes false information is really the best thing to capture attention. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. It makes the world so difficult to work through. So my next question is for Dr. McNitt, on the same line here, but from your vantage point, Dr. McNitt, in public health, how does misinformation tilt the delicate balance between doing the public good versus allowing individual choice? Can you share a real-world example where misinformation significantly changed public behavior or trust in science? And did anything counter it?
Well, I think the COVID-19 pandemic is a perfect example that I think probably everyone here is very familiar with. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's probably a lot of people out there who are much smarter than me that are studying what happened with the pandemic, kind of how we got into that situation and how to fix it for next time. I do think that I do think it's very complicated, because I think there was a lot of things at play. I think that both Joe and Jessie have kind of already touched on. Politics was involved, mistrust was involved, mistrust of government was involved. I think just a lot of things kind of came together at the same time to just sort of create the perfect storm for misinformation. I think the public health community has kind of beat themselves up a lot about what happened. And I think some of that criticism is warranted, but I think that the fundamental disconnect that happened was at the time that the pandemic hit, we had a president who was much more interested in sowing division and in being promoting himself rather than unifying the country behind a plan of action. And he's not an empathetic person. I don't think he really cares what happens to people. And that was just really the wrong person at the wrong time. And I think kind of things went downhill from there because it was just really hard for everyone to come back from that. And obviously we're still like not back from that. One thing that I thought at the time was, this should have been our greatest generation moment. It should have been the time for all Americans to come together and be like, we have to work together on this, even though it's hard, even though it's uncomfortable, even though it's difficult, even though we're being asked to do things that maybe we don't want to do or don't agree with. Like, we really need to pull together. And so I think there was just a real lack of leadership. It's really hard to pin it on one thing, but I think a real lack of leadership is, from my perspective, one of the main things that just help things just kind of fall apart. But I would be really interested to hear what the other panelists have to say about that.
I wanted to add, I'm sorry, in terms
Go ahead.
of the circulation of the misinformation, I guess to piggyback off of Dr. Pierre and Jessie, I think that with the circulation of the misinformation, I know we like to say this is kind of like a microwave society and everyone wants everything, really quick and fast. So whenever someone presents information with a specific title, a lot of people don't necessarily go in to do research to find out whether or not this title is actually a credible title. Is this person really a researcher? Is this person really a physician? And so long as you tag a specific title onto your name with the information that you're spreading, I find that it's very easy for patients to believe, okay, it was said by a doctor, so it has to be accurate. And then the information is spread that way.
Great. Well, we'll get into the next section. Will help us kind of learn how to compete with that. So it's clear, though, that misinformation has serious consequences, not just for individuals, but for the broader public health system. So, Dr. Pierre, you've written and researched about false beliefs and conspiracy theories. By the way, your book False is a wonderful read on the subject, well researched, and covers so much more than we have time for here today. But in False, you describe several fascinating psychological concepts, things like the illusory truth effect, confirmation bias, and the bias blind spot that help explain why people sometimes cling to misinformation, even when evidence suggests otherwise. You also propose what you call the 3M model to explain how mistrust, misunderstanding, and motivated reasoning make us believe things that aren't true. How might recognizing these patterns in ourselves be one of the first steps in resisting misinformation? And please I know your book covers this, and I'm going to ask if you can take 5 to 8 minutes or so to try to answer that. And I apologize for the short time on it. Please go ahead.
Sure. So yeah, this is my favorite topic, to try to better understand why, and I often use the word we throughout the book, why we believe things that aren't true. So this isn't really a us or them phenomenon. Human beings have a certain universal liability to embrace, and sometimes embrace very strongly, things that aren't true. And yes, the book covers a whole host of different psychological explanations, some of which you mentioned. But indeed, I like to simplify it, and particularly when I think about intervention, what can we do to change beliefs? I like to use what I call the 3M model. And so the 3 M's are mistrust, misinformation, and motivated reasoning. So just to touch upon those real quickly, sorry, there's a fly that keeps worming in front of my head. So mistrust, right? So I often say that, if you think about why we believe things, there's a short list of sort of rationales and reasons. One is that some things we just believe intuitively, right? It feels true. We also believe things because it's our subjective experience, right? Flat earthers sometimes will say, well, I believe the earth is flat because if you look on horizon, it looks flat. So that's a subjective experience explanation. But the reality is, and particularly when we talk about medical information, we all have areas where we don't know a lot and we have to rely on the testimony of others. And that's where information and misinformation come in. So when we mistrust authoritative sources of information, and if we go back to talking about COVID-19, if we don't trust the CDC, if we start to believe that Anthony Fauci is a bad guy who's got some ulterior motive, then when we mistrust those sources, then we pivot and we start looking at, RFK Jr., right? Or the Children's Defense Fund, which is what he headed for many years, which is one of the main so-called anti-vax sources of information. So we become vulnerable to misinformation when we quote unquote go looking for answers, doing our research and going looking for answers. And then there's the motivated reasoning piece, which is what we do, what our brains do when we encounter information. And this is related to confirmation bias, which simply put is that when we search for information and when we encounter information, we gravitate to information that reinforces what we already believe or what we want to believe. And then we swipe past, discredit, or ignore information that refutes it. And so what's the end result? The end result is we strengthen our convictions because that's sort of what we call identity protective cognition. Much of this process is really just about making us feel better about ourselves rather than actually looking for the truth. So I think if we think about false beliefs, and particularly as clinicians or as scientists who are hoping to shift belief more towards the truth, we have to think about those three components. How do we make people more trusting of authoritative or reliable, I shouldn't use the word authoritative, right? Because that sounds oppressive, but reliable, accurate sources of information. How do we gain trust? How do we regain trust? And then, as I alluded to before, if we live in this free or flea market of information, we have to do a better job of putting reliable information out there. And thinking better about how do we compete in that marketplace when the loud, raucous voices get noticed more. And then I think particularly as clinicians, I'm a full-time clinician, we have to recognize that the motivated reasoning piece, that is the ideological affiliation, particularly at this moment in time, is actually one of the best predictors of false beliefs about medicine, particularly when we talk about things like vaccines. And certain other categories. Reproductive health actually is one of them, or beliefs about firearms from a public health standpoint. The best predictor, one of the best predictors, isn't age, it's not ethnicity, it's not level of education, it's political affiliation. And that wasn't actually true to a significant extent pre-pandemic. If you look over the past 2 decades, beliefs about vaccines really wasn't a partisan issue. In fact, I live in Marin now, right? So 20 years ago, the stereotypical anti-vaxxer was a liberal, soccer mom, white soccer mom, the people I live around now. And now that's really pivoted where we've seen just in the past 5 or 6 years, now this sharp divergence where it's really conservatives / Republicans that are much more likely to embrace anti-vax tropes. And so that's, again, what we have to think of in terms of intervention is recognizing those three pieces. And final comment is, of course, things have sort of turned on their head, right? Because a couple of years ago, when we talked about the CDC, now we have a completely different CDC, right? Where all the previous people have been cast aside, and now there's RFK's handpicked people. Now it's like we're living in bizarro world right now, where now I'm the person saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't believe the CDC, or the head of DHS. And so it's really, I think, very challenging from that perspective.
Great, thank you on that perspective. I think we all need to come to your clinic to get replenished here with health. Dr. Seiler, from a data science perspective, why does misinformation spread faster than accurate information online? And are there identifiable patterns or triggers? Do social media influencers have a significant impact?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that we see in studies that look at social media and specifically algorithms that drive social media interactions is that it is this point about engagement, right? These loudest voices, the shiniest voices that get that engagement. And sometimes it's not even engagement that's positive. It's not even like, I'm gonna
Yeah.
retweet this thing that this person says because I agree. It's that sort of like, oh, I can't believe this person thinks that, or, so you're feeding into the algorithm when you disagree with someone, but still repost their content in some way. So, these social media algorithms are definitely part of it. I think, yes, yeah, influencers absolutely play a role. And I think one of the interesting components of that to me is this question of that Dr. Pierre was talking about with motivated reasoning and kind of moving on from, like, oh, I don't believe that, so let me go looking for this answer. One of the really fascinating things that we do is um, one of the things that when we're assessing information, when we're hearing something, we're not only assessing that information, but we're also deciding if we trust the person who's talking to us.
Wow.
So one
Yeah.
of the challenges we're facing is, and Dr. Maloney spoke to this too, about like how long it takes to build a trusting relationship with a patient is, we assess a message based on the messenger as much as the message itself. So if the messenger reminds me of me, or if the messenger reminds me of like someone I really think is smart and, brave and fantastic, and I want to be like them, or if the messenger is able to tap into my vanity and reflect things that I like or want to like about myself, then I'm gonna be more likely to say like, yeah, this is it. This seems right. Cause like, yeah, they're saying true things. And part of that can be um it's really easy to hijack your vanity. And I don't want to say nobody's intelligent, and, we can't see through these things, but just to say, I think this is a mechanism. One way you can hijack someone's vanity is by saying like, oh, well, you've kind of figured this out. You know that you don't have to actually do XYZ in order to whatever. Yeah, you're like smarter than average. So what you've probably figured out is this. And then once you start following that line, what you get to is, so you're going to want to buy the product I'm selling, right? It's for people who are like a little smarter than average, a little bit better, like, maybe you're a better mom than the others. This is a product for you. So like weaponizing the things that tap into our vanity that way, or that tap into parts of our identity. Being a good mom, being a good parent, being a good friend, being smarter than other people, whatever it is. Those are the things that influencers can do with a great amount of subtlety, and I think a great amount of success in order to drive misinformation.
Wow, that's so important. Well, now, now that we understand how misinformation takes hold, let's turn to what can be done about it. So we can get to the audience questions in a few minutes here. But Dr. Seiler, again, we hear terms pre-bunking and debunking more often now. Can you explain what they mean and what makes them effective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're probably more familiar with the idea of debunking, so maybe I'll just start there. And that's a sort of, you've heard something, and now you're seeing the idea deconstructed a little bit. So you're taking an argument apart and pointing out the specific components that are inaccurate or being misrepresented, right? So debunking happens after an exposure to a piece of misinformation. Pre-bunking happens before. And there's a few different ways that pre-bunking works. One is just a really strong education, right? So I think if you walk in with a strong science education of the type that you get in a like really good public school in the United States, right? Where it's like, oh, science is complicated. And we used to think this, but now we think this. And the scientific consensus changes on some things, but like we generally know where the sun and earth are relative to each other. That's not really in question, even though it took us a while to get there, right? That sort of
Yeah.
nuance. That's a for that appreciation for nuance and scientific understanding is a form of pre-bunking, right? That understanding of the scientific process is a form of pre-bunking. Some basic biology too can be considered just a form of pre-bunking, right? The little voice in your head that gets skeptical when someone says, "Did you know that vaccines can change your DNA?" And then you go back and you think like, "Man, that really doesn't fit with anything I learned about DNA in high school." So just a good science education can be pre-bunking. There are also more specific models like inoculation theory, and that's sort of a metaphor that aligns with what we understand about vaccines, where you expose someone to sort of a weakened misinformation, right? Like a vaccine is a weakened form or not a live form of the actual, I'm not a vaccinologist, sorry. But in responding to that weakened form of misinformation, your brain goes, wait a minute, absolutely not, and builds up all these arguments in sort of defense to becoming defensive about your own belief on a topic. Like, no, 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 like I've never thought about this before, but that's bonkers, and here's how I know. And then you go in search of more information, so you're mounting sort of an intellectual immune response to this weakened misinformation. And then when you see the stronger form out in the wild, you get a wild exposure, then you have that already built in sort of immune response. So that's another form of this sort of idea of inoculation theory is another form of pre-bunking.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Pierre, can people do, let me start over again. What can people do when someone they care about believes false information without alienating them or damaging the relationship, especially when the misinformation is putting loved ones at health risk, like taking ivermectin for a cancer cure-all or refusing to vaccinate children?
Yeah, that's probably the most frequent question I get, particularly around this time of year, right? The variation
Absolutely.
is, what do I do at Thanksgiving dinner where, Uncle Freddie is coming over and he believes XYZ, whether it's about health or politics or what have you. And so when people ask me that question, my initial response is always, what is your goal? Right? Because if your goal is to change that person's mind from the get-go, you're probably not going to succeed. When I talk about identity protective cognition, when people are challenged, when their beliefs are challenged, and the idea of identity protective cognition recognizes that oftentimes our very identity is tied to our beliefs. Therefore, if you're attacking my beliefs, you're attacking me. And what's going to happen? We're going to react defensively. So you may, in the long game, be interested in getting someone closer to the truth, but you can't start there. How do you start? And I think most clinicians know this, certainly as a psychiatrist who does psychotherapy, I know this. You start by establishing rapport with someone. And how do you do that? You demonstrate empathy. And we could define empathy as just understanding where someone's coming from, really appreciating that. And the only way to do that is to listen, and to listen compassionately. Why? Oh, you believe this. Tell me more about that. That's so fascinating, because that's, I haven't heard of that. I haven't heard that vaccines change your DNA. Where did you learn that? What sources of information are you using? Oh, that's interesting, because I don't use that. So this is like the process, is to listen without trying to challenge. Now in psychotherapy, the challenging comes after you have that relationship with someone, right? Because now you've built the trust, and now that creates a space to challenge beliefs. I think too often we're trying to jump in and change minds initially. And certainly on social media, as Dr. Seiler said, the algorithms drive that, right? We tend to really want to jump in there when we're arguing, like, this sounds insane and I need to refute this, and and that just gets us nowhere. It just stirs the pot and actually makes people that much more grounded in their beliefs, so that they're not budging. So the answer, to bring it full circle about, what do we do with family members, is you first, you listen, you talk to them, and you really understand where they're coming from. And you show them that even though we have a difference in belief, that doesn't mean that I think you're an idiot, or that I'm never going to see you, or you're not invited to Thanksgiving dinner anymore. That then creates a space to then have an ongoing dialogue where there might be room to change one's mind. And, let's be clear, sometimes it means you have to change your own mind, right? We're not right 100% about everything. There has to be some space to have that, give and take.
Could I add a couple points to that? I think that's just an excellent.
Sure, go ahead.
The first is that I think one of the hardest parts of this is that you are not the right messenger for everyone you love, right? There are so many people I feel deeply obligated to, because I have this education and because I have this background and all these work experiences in public health communications, I feel very deeply obligated to everyone in my life because of that. And I imagine we all do to some degree, right? Because that's what loving people is, right? Is wanting them to be healthy and happy. So we want these things for people. We want to be like, oh, no, 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 like, hold on. Like, it is really important to get a COVID booster, like even if you're healthy and young and don't think, but you're not the right person for everyone, right? And even if you love them very, very much. So you might have a family member who is not going to hear it from you. And I think that's really, really hard to recognize and really, really hard to navigate. But I just want you to like take yourself off the hook, give yourself some grace, it is possible that this is just not going to work. The other thing I want to say is I think the goal for me is to make myself very easy to sit next to, by which I mean keep myself approachable on these topics. Because of the, as Dr. Pierre and Dr. Maloney have said, this takes time, this takes relationship building. If you stay, in this person's mind as someone who is easy to sit next to, easy to engage with, easy to talk to, your odds of success are much higher, I think.
It sounds like you would be invited back to Thanksgiving dinner, I think. I would have you. And
I'm a
Dr.
great
Pierre and all
baker,
of you.
so
Dr. Pierre, I want to go back to your book, Faults, and you talk about the holy trinity of truth detection. How can these steps help us with stemming the flow of misinformation?
Yeah, so I was raised Catholic, so first of all, apologies for calling it the Holy Trinity, but the Holy Trinity of truth detection, irreverently, is composed of three components, and the three components are intellectual humility, cognitive flexibility, and analytical thinking. And so intellectual humility, what does that mean? That just means acknowledging, I think one of the speakers said this early on, it's acknowledging that we're not right about everything, right? That as individuals, we have to acknowledge that sometimes we're wrong, right? We're all wrong about certain things. That's intellectual humility. Cognitive flexibility is related. It means, and this is kind of where science comes in, right? It means the so-called scientific way of thinking is acknowledging that we should modify our beliefs in the setting of new data or a new study or better data. And again, that's not intuitively how we think. If you think even about politicians, for example, right? Like, for example, President Obama was often taken to task for being dithering, quote unquote. And what did that mean? It meant that when he had a question, he would consult with experts and he would think about it, right? And he would go through to make up his mind. But I think culturally, or maybe just even as human beings, we tend to like people who have these strong convictions, right? They believe this and they're unbudging. And that's such an unscientific way of thinking. So cognitive flexibility is again saying, well, I'm going to approach this, a question, and I'm going to be able to change my beliefs if the quality of evidence is good. And then analytical thinking, I always struggle with this word. People sometimes talk about critical thinking. I struggle because it makes it sound like you need to be smart or you need to be good at calculus or epidemiology or statistics or something like that. And that's not really what this is talking about. All analytical thinking means is that when you encounter information, at least in the back of your mind, you recognize this might not be accurate. And so before I agree with it or retweet it or share it with someone, I slow down and I go, you know what, maybe this information's not correct. And let me look at the source and let me look at the study it's referring to and let me, and going through that process. And we know from cognitive science research that when people slow down and they do that process, when they engage in that process, which is sort of skepticism in a certain way, that increases the chance that we then embrace things that are true rather than false. So that's my holy trinity. And those are really guidelines for all of us as individuals. Now, the guidelines for healthcare clinicians or institutions like the CDC or, a university, those are a little bit different. But I think those are things that we can all do as individuals to make it more likely that we'll embrace beliefs that are true.
Great, thank you. We're running a little bit over, I think, right now, and I was going to ask all the panelists, maybe you can think of this in your answers to the audience about giving key pieces of advice to the public on how to recognize and resist misinformation and what reputable medical sources you might have to recommend. So I'm going to say thank you to all. That gives us a basic foundation for understanding both the scope of the problem and some of the ways forward. We acknowledge this introduction is intentionally brief, and our audience may wish to go deeper into any of the questions already asked or ask the question to another panelist. So in this next segment, we'll open up to answer the written audience questions that have been placed in the Zoom Q&A section and explore what individuals and communities can do to promote reliable science-based information. We will try to get to all the questions. If we don't, we will try to explore that in our recorded event later. Okay, so the first question I have up is from Michelle. Which strategies have you found most helpful in correcting misinformed thinking with families or friends? I think the question's been answered by panelists, but maybe if somebody else wanted to answer or add anything to it, please speak up. That was our top question from our audience.
I know I already spoke on this. I have one more strategy I think might be nice to add to this.
Okay,
I find that it can be really helpful once you've established trust, to identify points of ambivalence that the person in front of you has about the thing you're talking about. So if they think that vaccines are, if they're just starting to think that vaccines are harmful or unnecessary, but they in the past have, chosen to be vaccinated and gotten through a bunch of flu seasons and have some feelings about that, or if they, trust their doctor in general and have been seeing the same doctor for a while, but now they're starting to think like, oh, I don't know if they have my best interests at heart. Anytime there's a place of ambivalence, a place where you feel strongly in sort of a couple different directions, need that, like need as in bread, like stick an elbow in there and just be like, oh, but like I thought you loved Dr. So and so. You've had so many great experiences with them. So what's, sort of changing your mind about that? Any points of ambivalence, I think, are really compelling places where we might be able to swing back into the direction of trust. So that's kind of a one I try to pursue with when I'm speaking with individuals.
super. Any other panelists have answers to that question of Michelle's?
I have an answer, but I'm conscious of talking too much and want to give the other panelists a chance before I offer mine.
So Dr. Maloney or Dr. McNitt, any questions on how to correct misinformed thinking with families or friends? If not, that's okay.
I'm happy to answer, and then if someone
Okay,
else
Dr. Pierre.
wants
Yep.
to, all right. So I wanted to answer because just a personal experience just came up in this past week. I was working with a patient who was profoundly depressed and had what we call catatonic symptoms in the setting of this depression, and had taken various medications to no avail. And we were talking about the possibility of treating with ECT, electroconvulsive treatment, which of course has a long history of stigma about it, and there's quite a bit of misinformation related to ECT. And so a couple different things. We had a family meeting, right? So it wasn't just a dialogue between myself and the patient. It was with family, all of whom were strongly in support of doing ECT. And back to the inoculation or the pre-bunking piece, I brought up that, people of my generation have all much of what we think we know about ECT is based on Jack Nicholson and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I brought that up and I said, you may have, seen Jack Nicholson, right? So that's the idea of in this case, not quite pre-bunking, but the idea of, oh, you may have seen this information out there. And here's what you might want to think about that information, right? Like that was not an accurate portrayal, or that was a portrayal of what ECT might have been like in the 1950s. It's much different now. And then the patient had a lot of questions about personal experience, right? Goes back to what I said about trust. Me in the metaphorical white coat, there's only so much that person's going to believe in terms of what I say. I've never had ECT, right? So that person said, oh, well, what I'd really like to hear is testimonials of people who had ECT. And I said, well, there's some on YouTube, for example, or we could get you a video. And the patient said, well, what I'd really like to hear is about people who had ECT at this facility, right? And I said, yeah, that makes sense. And like, let me look into that for you. And we didn't have to come to a decision that day. I gave space to say, yeah, let's get you that information, continue to talk to your family, and let's move forward. So that I thought just offered a nice synopsis of a number of different strategies kind of used simultaneously to get people, exposed to, I think, more reliable information, and then to use that to make health decisions.
Very good. Our next question comes from Isha. What are some strategies to use to determine if a fact is likely to be incorrect? What are the red flags for you? Dr. McNitt or Dr. Maloney, do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, go ahead, Dr. Maloney.
I think red flags for me or things that I'm looking out for would be the source of the information. So where's the information coming from? Is it just primarily, being promoted by an influencer, or what is the source of the information? I think is the biggest thing for me. And then what, like Dr. Pierre said, taking a step back once you encounter the information and looking into, where's the data coming from? What is the study that's being used to come up with this information? So I think, instead of just forwarding information, stopping and actually analyzing the information and assessing where it's coming from and whether or not the data is accurate is important.
Dr. McNitt, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I think, we in my work, we deal with people, more, I deal with people on the population level. I'm not really dealing so much with people one-on-one, other than my teenager who gets a lot of her medical information on TikTok. And I do tell her, like, TikTok is not a good place to get medical information, just sort of full stop. And also just, red flags for me are like kind of when the answer is too easy. I think people do really like to have that easy answer. But I think you have to, think a little bit harder when it just seems like it's too easy. When people tell you like it's this one simple thing, or when they tell you that they're telling you a big secret that other people are keeping from you. That's definitely a big red flag. Like, doctors know this, but they don't want you to know. It's like, why would your doctor not want you to know something that would be good for your health? Like, that just doesn't really make any sense. And just kind of just like on the population level, kind of what, and going back to a little bit of what Dr. Seiler was saying about being the right messenger, that's something that we try to tap into. We work with local health departments, and local health departments work with community-based organizations, and we also work with community-based organizations at the state level. And we're trying to find those trusted messengers. We're trying to find those people who can, have relationships with the communities that we're interested in reaching. So they know how to talk to them. They know what their concerns are. They know, how to reach them, and they're trusted. And those are the people that we work with to get out a lot of our information about vaccines. And, also one thing that was mentioned, it's true that public health information and a lot of health information, nutrition information, it's super boring. Like, it's, eat your vegetables. It's super boring. And so we're kind of like really up against, it's a really big problem, because we don't have a lot of flashy things to say. We don't have really sophisticated social media campaigns. We don't have a lot of money for that kind of thing. And it's kind of, our message is kind of boring, but I think just being consistent and being trustworthy go a long way.
Great, thank you. I have another question. This is for Dr. Maloney. Are there aspects of women's healthcare that are particularly subject to medical misinformation?
I think that one where, like I said earlier, whenever there's a big change, patients are looking for some sort of guidance, and so misinformation can be presented. So when we're going through pregnancy, I think there's so much nuance in each pregnancy, and each pregnancy is different. And so patients are constantly looking for information to support doing one thing or another thing, whether or not they should use a particular medication or not. When there's another big change, like with perimenopause or menopause, you're looking for information to help support you through the change. And so whenever there's these big transitions that are happening in women's healthcare, I think at those points in life are times when it's very easy to get caught up with, influencers or people running with a topic and giving information on how to manage a particular change.
I'm going to throw out a question regarding what you advise for Tylenol during pregnancy, since that was a pretty hot issue several weeks back. Maybe it's calmed down a little bit, but how do you deal with that?
Again, I think building trust and having a relationship with the patient is going to be the most important starting basis for managing how we're going to move forward. But then also understanding what the specific concerns are regarding using Tylenol in pregnancy. I know it's whether or not there's a link to autism. But then understanding the risk associated with not using anything at all. So if there is a fever that needs to get treated, or the pregnant patient is in pain, there are limitations to what medications we can give. And so, looking at the risk associated with not treating the problem versus the theoretical risk of treating the problem. So sitting down and having a conversation, understanding what the concerns are from the patient's perspective, and then presenting information to support why we're going to go in a particular direction. So the American College of OBGYN released a statement regarding the use of Tylenol. We still think that Tylenol is safe and one of the better pain management and fever management options in pregnancy, and I continue to use it as an option in pregnant patients.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Maloney. I have a note from Dr. Seiler. Jessie says that she has written about this recently, and the CSPI sounds like it was probably a newsletter, and we'll try to put that, it's in our chat for the panelists, but we'll try to put that out in our recorded video if people would like to take a look at that, which also is what science says about Tylenol and autism. Let's see, let's go to a question from CS. Any ideas on how to respond to health misinformation online? If we comment to present accurate information, it also gives the original post more attention. To engage or not to engage? Maybe Dr. Seiler, would this be a good one for you?
Yeah, I would say don't engage. I think just because of what engagement means in social media land, it's just not going to have the intended effect, right? It's just going to boost the misinformation most likely. I also think, again, that it comes back to this idea of you're not the right person for every argument, right? Or for every person online. I have a whole entire PhD and a master's in public health, I have over a decade of work experience in this field. And there are people who are not going to believe me, and that's fine. That's probably good. But that means that we just have to be really careful and calibrate our efforts to, find people who are confused and have questions, right? You don't really win arguments online. I don't know if anyone has ever won an argument online, frankly. All you can do is pour fire on the flame. On the other hand, I love arguing, and I also love talking to strangers. I'm very annoying, I'm very extroverted, and I have a lot of opinions. So this is a hard thing for me to not do, right? So I think, develop other ways of responding to that impulse, right? I think that might be a good idea. Find people who do want to talk with you about this stuff, right? Maybe find people who want to read some scientific literature, read a book together, so you can have those conversations and express some of that frustration. Because it is really frustrating to see the stuff pop up online. But yeah, I would say don't engage. It will get you nowhere, I don't think.
Good to know. Good to know. So I have another question from our viewer, Sakina, if I said that right. My apologies if not. How do we know whether information is real now, given the proliferation of artificial intelligence? Boy, that opens a whole nother can of worms up. Anyone want to grab that one first?
Oh, I'm happy to. I've done a fair amount of writing about AI in the recent months. So let's see. I'm trying to come up with a simple answer. Yeah, I mean, again, I think it speaks to informational sources. I mentioned that, in my lifetime, we pivoted from having these sort of select number of trusted, authoritative sources of information to now a myriad number. And now on top of that, we have AI. And so even, we know that all of us, including physicians, look for health information online, right? We Dr. Google, right? That's a thing. And now, in addition to doing a Google search and getting 20 hits about whatever topic, now we have the distilled answer from AI at the top often. And I think the key thing that people have to understand, people meaning we all have to understand about so-called AI, is what those are, right? The word the I in AI really doesn't apply, right? Chatbots that are based on large language models are not intelligent. They're not thinking. They're just one of my friends who works in that industry calls them next word prediction engines. They're good at they have access to millions and millions of bits of information. And they're good at taking questions that you type in a chat box and returning an answer that makes sense. That's what they're designed to do. What they're not designed to do is to give accurate or reliable information. And that's why we know that in the past year, we've seen many, many examples of so-called AI hallucinations, people asking questions like, how can I keep the cheese on my pizza? And the AI saying, well, you might want to use glue, which would be terrible advice to follow if you were baking a pizza and serving it to your guests. So I think we have to realize that AI, particularly when we're talking about chatbots, which is usually what people talk about when we're talking about AI these days, are not to be trusted as reliable sources of information. That's not what they're built to do. That's not what they do, and we shouldn't mistake them for such. And so when I do a Google search, and we all do them, I sometimes do look at the AI answer. I admit to that. But if I'm looking at it, and particularly if I see something that's written, I'll click on the link and I'll say, "Ooh, what was that? Where did that answer actually come from?" And sometimes what you see is, in fact, there was some recent studies showing that a lot of AI answers are based on like Reddit chats. Well, Reddit would not be a place I would go looking for medical information by and large. So it's really, again, about going back to the source and answering this question of like, how do you navigate that ecosystem of information and decide what's true or not or reliable or not? I mean, that's really what the process is. For me as a physician, if I have a novel clinical question about how to best treat my patient, I go on PubMed and I will sometimes, pull 20 different articles, sometimes 30, 40 different articles, and I'll read through them all and I'll try to synthesize that based on my training of, statistics and what this study shows and what's this other one that contradicts it, how to synthesize that. That's really what the process is, from the scientific perspective. But again, that's not what the consumer does. The consumer will oftentimes get the easy regurgitated answer and stop there, right? There's been recent studies showing that people usually look at the first AI answer and then they're done and they move on. And that often is done through that lens of confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, where we take the answer when it agrees with what we want to believe.
Good point. I think we also have to remember that the AI is really good at making up videos of people, and they look like real people talking too. And need to check your sources and double check it. So I'll move on. We have a host of questions here. Looks like the next few are kind of all connected. From Doug and Tanya. I know them. Thank you guys for being on. What are good trusted sources for medical information in the current environment? For instance, what could someone do to get accurate information about a specific topic, such as statins and the risks associated with them? Let's see here. I think the next one, another question is, what is your read on how we can trust the institutions we use to trust for the most accurate information, such as the CDC and the current administration's influence on who is in charge there? Moreover, the current administration has been sowing distrust in our public health institutions as a whole. How can we combat this? And I'm being told that we need to have you answer each question separately. So let's go back. I thought they were a little more related. So Let's go back to Doug and Tanya's question about statins and how to get accurate information on that topic and the risks associated with them.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
Just because I would love to plug my the work I do. So I work at the Center for Science in the Public Interest, and that's what we do. We try to elevate science in the name of the public interest. So everything we write is fact-checked and reviewed repeatedly and in great detail. So we do like to cover some of these topics, like Tylenol and autism, which I wrote. That's been up online for a few days now. But so something like the Center for Science in the Public Interest, if you don't want to believe me because I work for them, I understand that. Some of my favorites include Stat News and KFF. So Stat News just does a ton of public of the day. It's Stat News, STAT News. And they're just all sorts of different healthcare topics, and they've been wonderful for a long time and have some incredible science writers on their staff. I would also shout out KFF, which does a lot of health policy research and reporting. And it's just KFF. So the other place I would say in terms of trusted sources is actually, I'd say Dr. Louise McNitt, right? I would say if you're not super comfortable with the federal government at this point, you have incredible local public health access or resources, and the people who work in public health departments at the state and local levels are amazing, right? So I would start thinking about your state or local public health departments as trusted sources of information.
Great, thank you. The second question, I'll read it again, is what is your read on how we can trust the institutions we used to trust for the most accurate information, such as the CDC and the current administration's influence on who is in charge there? Moreover, the current administration has been sowing distrust in our public health institutions as a whole. How can we combat that? Dr. McNitt, do you want to try that, or does anyone else want to grab that one?
Sure. I mean, I think Jessie kind of started this.
Yeah, she did.
By her wonderful endorsement of local and state public health. I think that we're all really lucky to be in California, actually, because I think that leadership in California is really committed to making science-based health recommendations. And it's committed to not silencing people who who they don't disagree with. We see that happening in a lot of states, a lot of red states, unfortunately, where health departments are not allowed to talk about certain things like vaccines, or they're not allowed to mention COVID. We don't, luckily in California, we don't have those kind of restrictions on what we're allowed to talk about. So state and local public health, and there's still, I think everyone who's in public health, their heart breaks for the CDC right now. I think there's a lot of people who are working there and working really hard to try to do their best under really extremely difficult circumstances. And CDC has a ton of information. When I think a lot of you maybe have heard about the West Coast Health Alliance and how California has gotten together with a few other Western states to put out vaccine and other health recommendations. And when you start to try to stop referring to CDC, stop linking to information on CDC, you realize that they're really the source for just so much information, not just about vaccines, but about so many other health topics. So they still have a lot of good stuff there for sure.
Yeah.
And you can kind of see, I don't know if it's on purpose or if people are kind of doing things on the radar, but stuff that they had to take down a few months ago has quietly reappeared on their web pages. So I don't know if there's a little rebellion going on over there, but I would definitely try to check out stuff on the state website. We still do link to some CDC web pages, but we make sure that they have accurate information on them. And there's still a lot of good stuff out there, I guess is the bottom line about CC. It's just the vaccine stuff. We're going to continue to monitor it very closely here in California. And if things change and if we feel like our recommendations need to be different, we are right now for vaccines, instead of referring to CDC vaccine schedules, we're referring to the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Academy of Family Physicians and ACOG for vaccine recommendations.
By the way, I have to say your dashboard at the State Health Department is wonderful at tracking the latest viruses floating around in sewage water or whatever we've got now to know what's coming our way, what's on the East Coast and moving west and whatnot. Good job.
It's the
Ron
epidemiologists.
Pardon?
I said that's all the epidemiologists. They're fantastic.
Okay, but it's not very nicely put for an end user like myself. I have another question. I think Dr. McNitt, this might be appropriate for you, from Ron. He says, when community feedback contradicts epidemiological data, say around vaccine side effects or environmental health, how do you decide what to act on in the community?
Well, I'm not totally sure what he means by community feedback. Maybe concerns about side effects of vaccines and impacts on environmental. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I think we do have to keep in mind, though, that personal experience or personal anecdotes are very different from scientific inquiry and what we can find from doing scientific-based studies. So even if people maybe have a negative experience, that's a personal experience that's not necessarily generalizable to the whole population. So we really have to make sure that we're looking at good, rigorous scientific studies and not just saying, that's kind of what we see on social media. People will say, well, I had this experience, and so
Yes.
I think that vaccines are bad, or there's some contamination by environment that's affecting my health. But that might not necessarily be true. And there's a great example of this. If any of you ever saw that movie, Erin Brockovich,
Oh.
where there was concern in this small town in California that there was, I can't remember the name of the chemical, but there was a chemical that was found in some people's well water.
Yeah.
And there was a big suit that was brought against the water company where people claimed that this chemical was causing a big cancer cluster in the town. And the town actually won a settlement with the water company, but there actually was never a cancer cluster in that town. And what ended up happening was basically the whole town just got decimated, because then nobody wanted to live there anymore, and a lot of people moved out because they were afraid. But and so the people who couldn't afford to leave were kind of stuck there, and it was all based on people's kind of personal experience. Yeah, there was people in the town that had cancer, like there's people in every town that have cancer. But when scientists looked at it, there's a cancer registry in California. When they studied what was going on in that town, it had nothing to do with the chemical that was in the water. So you have to be really careful. I think I think Dr. Pierre I think we've all kind of mentioned that you have to be really careful about misinformation and disinformation, and that it can have really negative consequences for people.
We're running a little bit low on time. I guess I hate to end on this for the audience question, but this is from Bridget. It takes a little different tone for us, but sometimes people that are in charge in the medical field don't have the public's best interest at heart and do have their own agendas. It's important for us to question and to not constantly keep blaming political parties. Do the panelists have any comment or response to the statement? to the statement statement from one of our attendees. Not sure I know what that means. Anybody want to tackle that?
Well, I think I do think that our healthcare system has a big integrity problem. I think we have a healthcare system in this country that is based on profit. It's run by insurance companies that are, very interested in the bottom line. And I think that has really eroded a lot of people's trust in the healthcare system in general. And I agree. I think that's a really big problem, because then it does make you rightfully wonder, is my health insurance company or my doctor telling me what's best for me? Or are they telling me, what's going to be best for their bottom line? And I don't have the answer to that. Well, I kind of have an answer to that problem. I think we should have a single payer healthcare system, which I think might help. But yeah, I think that is an area where the medical community has kind of painted themselves into a corner. And yeah, I don't blame people who maybe question what their doctor is saying, if they feel like their doctor is making some kind of benefit. But I think most doctors mean well, and they do want what is best for their patient. And sure, there's some people like Dr. Oz that maybe I wouldn't trust so much, who are trying to sell you something. But I think for the most part, most doctors are really wanting to do what's best for their patients.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that as a physician. I mean, I will first of all agree with the sentiment of Bridget's comment or question. I think it's the responsibility of all of us as consumers of information and patients to have a healthy amount of skepticism about the information we encounter. I think it's very important when we work with clinicians or read published studies to look to see if there's conflicts of interest. We've had the Sunshine Act now for a couple decades. It's possible to look at your doctor and find out, how much money have they accepted from pharmaceutical companies. I think those are all legitimate things that, we should be concerned about. On the flip side, though, my concern is that I'm going to invoke a term called the wellness industry, is very good at exploiting that mistrust and saying, yeah, not only is Bridget right and we should be healthy skeptics, but actually the entire system is corrupt. And therefore, because of that, we shouldn't believe anything that comes from the so-called medical establishment. And again, going back to my 3M model, that means then that we're going to believe other information that is telling us that the medical establishment is corrupt and not to be believed. But if you think about those counter narratives, often what they're saying is, don't believe so-and-so, but believe me, right? And buy what I'm having to sell you, not just in terms of the information, but whether it's nutritional supplements, with someone asked about. So I often say that, so-called conspiracy theorists, one of the mantras among people who flock to conspiracy theories is to follow the money. And that's actually really good advice, but not just for, physicians or, healthcare people, but at purveyors of disinformation. How are they being funded? How are they profiting from the information that they're pointing out? And so I think that is healthy advice. And I often promote healthy skepticism, but not to be confused with denialism, where you just don't believe anything that, from one particular source.
Good point. Thank you. I think we're getting low on time, and I'm going to conclude the presentation for today. We hope you've learned what misinformation is, how it spreads so effectively, why we fall for false information or conspiracy theories, and what we can do to stem the flow of misinformation. If I could have the Jonathan Swift proverb back on the screen. Yeah, did that get posted? Well, remember back at the beginning, we had a proverb up on the screen that talked about a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. It's been 300 years since Jonathan Swift wrote that, and it kind of makes you wonder what he would write in today's world, or what we would write in today's world with that. So I want to send best wishes to each of you in seeking the scientific truth. We hope that you will share what you've learned today and try to practice a change in your search for truth with others. And thank you for spending the afternoon with us. You'll be receiving a webinar survey later about our presentation. We encourage you to help us improve for our next webinar. Many thank yous to give to our panelists. It was excellent. And the audience with your questions, appreciate it. Isha, you were my right-hand person here. I don't think I'd have made it without you. And Ward and Doug for their support in getting this up. Linda, who's my safety blanket here, Chantel on our team, and Zoe, who did a great brochure for us, and my family and friends with their kind words of support. So thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you.